70 years ago, in the summer of 1955, a tragedy shook America and ignited a movement. Emmett Till, a 14-year-old African American boy from Chicago, was brutally murdered in Mississippi after being accused of whistling at a white woman. His death and the decision of his mother, Mamie Till-Mobley, to hold an open casket funeral forced the nation to confront the raw brutality of racism in the Jim Crow South. So, as we reflect on the 70th anniversary of Emmett Till's murder, we're not just looking back at a painful moment in history, we're honoring his legacy, examining how his story shaped the civil rights movement, and understanding why his memory continues to resonate in today's fight for racial justice. So, in this video, we will explore the history of Emmett Till's life, the events that led to his tragic death, the national outrage that followed, and how his name still serves as a powerful symbol of truth, resilience, and the ongoing struggle for equality. And with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, let us begin with this video here today by going on and starting talking about the early life of Emmett Till from 1941 to 1955. So, Emmett Lewis Till was born on July 25th, 1941, at Cook County Hospital in Chicago, Illinois. His birth occurred at a moment when the United States was still navigating the aftershocks of the Great Depression and as World War II had loomed over the horizon. Chicago's South Side, where Emmett would spend his formative years, was a hub of Black migration, community resilience, and social contradictions. Emmett's mother, Mamie Carden Till, played the most pivotal role in shaping his life and identity. Mamie was born in the Mississippi Delta, a region synonymous with both the cultural richness of African American traditions and the entrenched violence of Jim Crow segregation. So her family relocated to Chicago during the Great Migration, part of the massive demographic shift that saw millions of African Americans flee the South between 1910 and 1970 in the search of economic opportunity, safety, and dignity. So Chicago, with its stockyards, its steel mills, and industrial jobs, so it represented a city of possibility, though it still carried the heavy weight of racial discrimination in housing, education, and employment. Now, Emmett's father, Lewis Till, was a complex and tragic figure in the family story. A soldier in World War II, Lewis was deployed overseas and stationed in Italy. In 1945, when Emmett was just 4 years old, Lewis was court martialed by the U.S. Army and executed for charges of rape and murder. And the details about his trial and conviction they remained murky, hidden from Mammy and Emmett until much later. So Emmett grew up unaware of his father's fate, and Mammy protected him from that knowledge, focusing instead on raising him with the values of respect, responsibility, and resilience. And this absence of his father, however, though it created an undercurrent of longing in Emmett's upbringing, one that Mammy filled by instilling both discipline and affection into her only son's life. So, family and friends affectionately nicknamed him Bobo. So, this name reflected his lively and daring nature. He was seen as a jokester, someone who could bring warmth into a room with his energy and his laughter. At the same time, the name symbolized the intimacy of a tight knit family unit, with Mammy at its center, who shouldered the dual responsibilities of being both mother and father to Emmett. Now, the south side of Chicago, it was a vibrant and complicated backdrop for Emmett's early life. So by 1940s and 1950s, the area had become a major hub for African American migrants, many of whom brought with them Southern traditions, foodways, music, and strong community bonds. And it was also an area marked by segregation and restrictive covenants that kept Black families confined to certain neighborhoods, overcrowded housing, and underfunded schools. So, despite these challenges, Chicago offered Emmett opportunities that his mother and grandparents never had in the Mississippi Delta. He was surrounded by a culture of resilience, churches, jazz clubs, corner stores, and schools that fostered solidarity and community pride. So within the environment, Emmett he stood out for his personality, and the family and his teachers they all described him as cheerful, talkative, and playful. He loved to make people laugh, and he was also known for his mischievous streak, often pulling harmless pranks that endeared him to peers. Yet beneath this playful exterior, Emmett had a strong moral compass. And Mammy, she was determined to raise him as a respectful and responsible young man, aware of the racial realities that shaped their world. Although Chicago did not practice Jim Crow segregation in the rigid, codified way that the South had did, de facto segregation. So really, de facto segregation, it was still deeply present around this time, though. Because see, black Chicagoans, they lived under economic marginalization, police discrimination, and racial prejudice. And Mammy was acutely aware of that. And as Emmett grew into adolescence, so these realities could shape his safety and opportunities. Now, at age 5, Emmett contracted poliomyelitis, also known as polio, which is a highly feared disease in the mid 20th century America. And the illness, it left him with a noticeable stutter, something that could have hindered his social development. Instead, Emmett, he learned to adapt with remarkable resilience because his targeted personality did not fade. In fact, he actually leaned into a social charm even more, often joking and laughing in ways that disarmed others from focusing on his speech impediment. So, family members recalled that he developed strategies to work around his stutter. For instance, when struggling with certain sounds, he would whistle lightly before speaking, which was an act that became second nature to him. And this habit, while it was practical for coping with his stutter, it would tragically intersect with the circumstances of his death a decade later. So the polio battle also showed his determination because unlike some children who were withdrawn by chronic illness, Emmett was eager to participate fully in life. He played with his friends, he helped around the house, and he carried himself with confidence despite the challenges that his condition presented. And this resilience, it became a defining characteristic of his identity. He was not pitied, but he was admired for his spirit. And also Emmett's bond with Mamie Till, really his bond with his mother, was one of the most the was one of the most defining features of his short life. As a single mother, Mamie shouldered enormous responsibility, but she poured herself into Emmett's upbringing. She emphasized education, cleanliness, respect for elders, and church involvement. She wanted him to have opportunities that were denied the generations before him. So she worked diligently to support the household, holding jobs as a clerk for the Air Force and other government positions. So her stability ensured that Emmett was never left wanting, and her protective instincts guided his behavior. So she often reminded him that, as a young black boy in America, he needed to be extra cautious, respectful, and aware of how he carried himself. Lessons that took on profound meaning later when he traveled south. For Emmett, Mammy was not just a parent, but also a source of strength. He admired her intelligence, her independence, and her ability to navigate life without relying on anyone else. And his friends noted that he mirrored her resilience, her refusal to be defined by loss or struggle. It was evident in Emmett's own spirited outlook on life. So, to fully understand Emmett's early life, it is crucial to recognize the contradictions of the mid 20th century black experience. Chicago's South Side represented both progress and limitation. On the one hand, Emmett was part of a community that was creating its own businesses, cultural centers, and political networks. On the other hand, systemic racism confined black people to second class citizenship in practice, if not in law. So Emmett grew up surrounded by examples of both hope and struggle. He witnessed the pride of black institutions and the resilience of everyday people. Yet he also saw the inequalities that restricted his neighbors' lives, from housing discrimination to police harassment. And this dual reality, it shaped the awareness that Mammy tried to instill in him: the need to be joyful and ambitious, yet cautious and respectful in a world that was not designed to protect him. And also, the next, we want to go on and talk about the journey south, August 1955. Now, in the summer of 1955, so this marked a profound turning point, not only for the life of Emmett Lewis Till, but also for the trajectory of the American civil rights movement. So at 14 years old, Emmett Till's journey from his home in Chicago, Illinois, to the small rural town of Money, Mississippi, was framed by the intersection of family, history, and the brutal racial realities of the Jim Crow South. And his departure, it carried layers of meaning, personal, cultural, and historical that make this moment one of the most pivotal preludes in the 20th century American history. Now, Emmett Till, he had grown up in Chicago, a northern city, once again shaped by the Great Migration. And his family, like millions of black families, they had all sought to escape the harsh racial caste system of the South by relocating to urban centers in the North. Chicago, though, once again, it was racially segregated in its housing and its schools and employment, it did offer black families opportunities that were simply unattainable in Mississippi. Now, Emmett's mother, Mamie Till-Mobley, was deeply protective of Emmett because, once again, she worked so diligently to provide him with stability after the loss of her husband, Lewis Till. And yet, despite their life in Chicago, Mississippi remained a site of cultural and familial connection because many African American families who had migrated north maintained strong ties to relatives down south. So for Emmett, this meant Mississippi was both a place of family bonding and a starkly different racial environment, one where the rigid codes of white supremacy reigned unchallenged. In August 1955, Emmett asked his mother for permission to spend part of his summer vacation with relatives in the Mississippi Delta. So his great uncle Moses Wright lived near Money, Mississippi, in Lafleur County, and other extended family members were rooted in the area. For Mammy, the decision was not simple because she knew the dangers of Mississippi for a black boy who had grown up in the relatively freer, though still discriminatory atmosphere of Chicago. So Mammy Till was fully aware of the racial etiquette required of black people in the South, such as avoiding eye contact with white people, never challenging a white person's word, stepping off the sidewalk if a white person passed, addressing the whites with differential titles such as sir or ma'am, and most critically, never being perceived as showing sexual familiarity or assertiveness toward white women. Now, violations of these unwritten codes often resulted in brutal beatings, jailings, or lynchings. Now, despite her apprehension, Mammy eventually relented. Like many mothers of the time, she wanted her son to know his extended family, to connect with his southern roots, and to experience a different way of life outside the industrial North. And this decision was underscored by a mixture of trust in family, guardianship, faith in Emmett's ability to follow her guidance, and the cultural norm of sending northern children back home for summers with southern relatives. Now, before Emmett had left, Mammy gave him one of the most meaningful items in the family, a ring that had belonged to his father, Lewis Till. Now, the ring was inscribed with the initials LT, and it symbolized continuity, heritage, and identity. For Emmett, wearing his father's ring was more than a sentimental gesture. It was a tangible connection to a parent he never fully knew. And Lewis Till's story, and once again, it was very complex and tragic. He was drafted in World War II. He had been court-martialed and executed by the U.S. Army in 1945. And Mammy, devastated, she rarely discussed the circumstances with her son, with her son in detail. So the ring thus became a silent relic of family history, a father's presence passed down to his son, and in turn, a marker of identity that would later play a chilling role in his story. So after Emmett's brutal murder, the ring became the sole item that his mother could use to positively identify his body. A cruel twist of fate that turned a symbol of connection into a piece of evidence of racial violence. Now, before Emmett boarded the train south, Mammy sat him down for a sobering conversation, and her warning was direct. And that warning was, be careful how you speak to white people. Now, for a 14-year-old boy who had grown up in Chicago, this caution may have seemed abstract. While Chicago, and once again, Chicago had its racial divisions and discrimination, the social codes were not nearly as suffocating and life threatening as those in Mississippi. Northern black youth, they could laugh, they could talk, and they can move with a degree of openness not tolerated in the South. So Mammy knew that this gap in experience made her son especially vulnerable. and her instruction reflected the harsh reality of the Jim Crow laws in Mississippi, where segregation was enforced by law and custom, and black individuals who stepped outside of the narrow boundaries of acceptable behavior toward whites risked instant and often fatal repercussions. So Mamie's concern was that her son, who had a playful and outgoing personality, might unknowingly cross a dangerous line in an environment designed to dehumanize him. In August 1955, Emmett boarded a train bound for Mississippi. The trip itself underscored the stark contrast between the North and the South. And as the train traveled farther into Dixie, the signs of Jim Crow grew unmistakable. Segregated restrooms, colored and white waiting rooms, and separate train cars. So the farther south the train went, the more these visible markers of institutionalized racism became part of the landscape. For Emmett, the ride may have been a mix of excitement and uncertainty. He was a teenager, eager for adventure, but he was also stepping into an environment that was vastly different from his own environment. His outgoing, joking nature, nicknamed Bobo by his friends and family, was at odds with the strict racial etiquette of Mississippi. So when Emmett arrived in Lafleur County, he entered a region that was one of the most poorest and most racially stratified in the country. And that, of course, being Money, Mississippi. So Money, Mississippi was a tiny town with only a few buildings, a gas station, a cotton gin, a small store, and surrounding cotton fields worked largely by black sharecroppers under exploitative conditions. So this landscape represented the heart of the Jim Crow South. The vast plantations, the white landowners, the wielding unchecked power, and the black families surviving under the systems designed to perpetuate dependency and subjugation. So for Emmett, accustomed to the urban Chicago, the rural Delta was a different world entirely. Now, the weight of Mamie's warning, it loomed over Emmett's visit, though perhaps not with the same clarity for him as it did for her. At 14, he was still a boy, playful, impressionable, and unaware of the depths of white supremacy's violence. For his mother, however, the stakes were painfully clear. She had let her son go with her mother's protective anxiety, knowing that even a misinterpreted word, a glance, or a laugh could put him in mortal danger. So this journey south then was not merely a family trip, it was a crossing of boundaries, geographic, cultural, and historical. It was the meeting of two worlds: the northern black experience, shaped by migration, and the southern black experience, shaped by centuries of slavery, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow. And the next part we want to talk about is the inciting incidents. The Bryant's grocery and meat market store that happened on August 24th, 1955. Now to understand the gravity of what occurred inside and outside of Bryant's grocery and meat market, it is essential to first situate the event within its environment. Because once again, Money, Mississippi was a small rural town in the heart of the Mississippi Delta. And the Delta was one of the poorest regions in the US, but also one of the most racially segregated and socially rigid areas. And Jim Crow laws, they govern nearly every aspect of black life, from where one could eat, where one can sit, or even use the restroom, to the most basic codes of speech and behavior toward white people. Now, for a 14-year-old boy from Chicago, such as Emmett Till, the rules of racial etiquette in Mississippi were unwritten, but they were brutally enforced. So in Chicago, while segregation, and once again, like it did exist in this time in Chicago, but once again, it was less rigid, police through violence. And Mississippi, though, a black boy talking to a white woman or even looking at her in a way, it was deemed to be improper, and it was enough to spark accusations of assault, harassment, or worse. And it was within this charged atmosphere that Emmett entered Bryant's grocery and meat market on the evening of August 24th, 1955. Now, Bryant's grocery. So, Bryant's grocery was a small, rundown country store in Money, Mississippi, and it primarily catered to black sharecroppers and their families who worked on plantations nearby. Now, the store, it sold basic goods such as like soda, candy, gum, groceries, and household necessities. And though the clientele, it was mostly black, the store was owned by a young white couple, and the couple was Roy Bryant. And Roy Bryant, so this, and and if you can see my mouse that's moving right now, yeah, my mouse is moving right here. This is Roy Bryant. So so it was owned by Roy Bryant, who was a 24-year-old former soldier, and this is his wife, uh, Carolyn Bryant, who was a 21-year-old mother of two. So Carolyn often worked the cash register when her husband was away driving trucks for supplemental income. By most accounts, she was working the counter that fateful night when Emmett and his cousins had walked in. Now, Emmett Till, so he was staying with his great uncle Moses, Preacher Wright, and his cousins in money for part of his summer vacation. And on this evening of August 24th, Emmett and several local teenagers, they gathered outside Bryant's grocery. And they were in good spirits. They were playing, they were laughing, they were enjoying themselves. And there were even some reports suggest that the boys had been picking cotton earlier that day. And the trip to the store was a simple errand to buy refreshments, buying refreshments like candy, gum, or soda. And also I do want to and also I do want to I want to also say this, but it's also important to note this. It's important to note that Emmett Till, though he was black, he was a city boy. So coming from Chicago, he didn't fully internalize the suffocating racial codes of the South, because family members, they would later say that they because later family members, they would later say that they had warned him to be careful how he acted around white people. And Emmett, he had a lively, playful personality and was known to joke around and show off. To his cousins, he sometimes exaggerated stories of girlfriends back home. And on this night, that confidence and his outsider sense of freedom, it would intersect tragically with the South's culture of racial terror. So, what allegedly happened? Now, there's been plenty of conflicting accounts about what really had happened on this night. Now, the central mystery of that evening is what exactly transpired between Emmett Till and Carolyn Bryant. Now, the testimonies, they vary, and Carolyn Bryant herself, she gave contradictory accounts over time. So the first one we'll go is the wolf whistle version, and this is the most common narrative. So according to Emmett's cousins, as he exited the store, he either let out a loud whistle or a high pitched sound that resembled a whistle directed toward Carolyn. And in the racial climate of Mississippi, such an action was perceived as a direct affront to white womanhood and, by extension, to white male authority. And the second is the physical contact version. Now, in Carolyn's testimony during the 1955 trial, she claimed that Emmett had grabbed her hand while asking her for a date, and that he allegedly said, "You needn't be afraid of me, baby. I've been with white women before." Now, this account painted Emmett not as a playful boy, but as a threatening aggressor, an image that inflamed the white anxieties about black men and white women. And the third is the supportive the suggestive the suggestive words version. Now, some accounts suggested that Emmett may have said something flirtatious or teasing to Carolyn inside the store. However, though, there was no independent witness that ever corroborated this version beyond Carolyn's own statements. And then the last, that being the 2007 confession and retraction, and we'll get into that more also later on. But decades later, in 2007, Carolyn Bryant, then Carolyn Bryant Donham, she told historian Timothy Tyson that nothing that boy did could ever justify what happened to him. She even admitted that Emmett never physically touched her, never harassed her, and never said the crude words that she had once claimed. And this admission, however, though it was complicated by her later denial of making such a confession, leaving the historical record in tension. So regardless of what had happened, historians, they largely agree the initial incident was exaggerated or fabricated, transformed into a racially charged accusation with deadly consequences. Now, when Emmett and the other boys realized the gravity of the situation, they quickly fled the store, and accounts suggest that the boys, they laughed nervously, half in jest, half in fear, about what had just happened. They knew the racial climate of Mississippi well enough to understand that any suggestion of impropriety between a black boy and a white woman that could ignite violence. So Carolyn Bryant, shaken and reportedly humiliated, would later recount the incident to her husband, Roy Bryant. Now, when he returned from a trip days later, so this retelling was not simply a private marital disclosure. It was a spark that once lit, it cannot be contained in the racial order of the South. Because for white men like Roy Bryant, protecting white womanhood was entangled with notions of honor, pride, and supremacy. Now, the allegation at Bryant's grocery, it cannot be understood in isolation because it was part of a larger pattern in the Jim Crow South, where accusations of black men making advances on white women had historically been used to justify lynching between the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And thousands of black men were lynched across the South under the pretext of protecting white women. And these charges were often fabricated, they were exaggerated, or they were based on consensual interactions, recast as assaults to fit white supremacist narratives. And thus, even though what happened inside Bryant's grocery lasted mere seconds, perhaps just a whistle or a glance, it carried the full weight of centuries of racial terror. Now, while what happened in the store, it may forever remain partly obscured by conflicting accounts, what is undeniable is that this minor, ambiguous incident was actually the spark that was a spark that lit the fuse. Because Carolyn Bryant's accusation, whether fabricated or exaggerated, it gave license to the white men in her family because Roy Bryant and his half brother J.W. Milam, and this here, and my mouse once again is moving. This is J.W. Milam right here. So this is Roy Bryant right here on the right, and this is J.W. Milam right here. Now, both of them pretty much gave license to the white men in their family. So whether once again fabricated or exaggerated, this gave them the chance for them to assert their own to assert their racial dominance through violence, because the crime was not in the act itself, but in the perception. A black boy from the North had allegedly transgressed against the sacred boundary of white womanhood in the South. For the men of Money, Mississippi, that was enough to justify deadly retribution. And now we move on to the next part with the abduction and the murder of Emmett Till. So at approximately 2:30 a.m., Roy Bryant and his half-brother J.W. Milam, they drove to the rural home of Moses Wright, Emmett's great uncle, near Drew, Mississippi. So the two men, they were armed, Milam with a pistol, and demanded that Wright surrender the boy. Now, Moses Wright, a black sharecropper in his 60s, he pleaded with them to let Emmett stay, insisting that he was just a child. And Wright's wife, Elizabeth Wright, and other relatives, including Emmett's cousins, they were awakened and they were terrified as the men forced their way inside. And despite their protests, Bryant and Milam insisted that they had to teach the boy a lesson. And Wright, he later testified in court under immense personal risk that he watched as the men dragged Emmett from his bed at gunpoint. He remembered Emmett being forced to put on his clothes quickly, and he recalled Bryant and Milam saying that they would return the boy once they had talked to him. But everyone in the house knew that that was a lie. It was a complete lie. So this act of midnight terror, it mirrored the countless other abductions of black men and boys in the South, where extrajudicial judicial violence was often carried out under the guise of protecting white womanhood. Now, after being shoved into the back of Milam's pickup truck, Emmett was taken on a harrowing journey. So over the next several hours, he endured unimaginable torture at the hands of Bryant and Milam, and the details of this ordeal come from later confessions, testimonies, and forensic reports. Now, the first is the severe beating. So Emmett was beaten with such intensity that his head and his body sustained massive blunt force trauma. His face was pummeled to the point of being nearly unrecognizable. And the autopsy later revealed fractures in his skull, jaw, and multiple facial bones. And the second is the mutilation of his eye. Now, in a particularly sadistic act, one of Emmett's eyes was gouged out. And this detailed confirmed by testimony, and the condition of his body underscored the depth of racial hatred behind the crime. And lastly, it was execution by gunpoint, because after the hours of torture, Emmett was shot in the head above the right ear with a .45 caliber pistol, and the bullet passed through his skull, instantly killing him. Now, Bryant and Milam were determined. So not only were they determined not only to kill Emmett, but to make his death a warning to others, because they took steps to ensure that his body would disappear. They located a 75-pound cotton gin fan, which was a heavy piece of machinery that was used in cotton processing, and they tied it to Emmett's neck with barbed wire, ensuring that the body would sink once placed in water. And they transported his body to the Tallahatchie River, a winding, muddy waterway often associated with the history of racial violence in Mississippi. And once at the riverbank, they dumped his mutilated body in the water, assuming it would never resurface. So 3 days later, on August 31st, 1955, Emmett Till's bloated and decomposed body was discovered by a local boy who was fishing near the Tallahatchie River. So his features were so distorted by the beating, the gunshot wound, and the decomposition that identification seemed impossible. However, though his great uncle Moses Wright, he identified the body by the silver ring that Emmett was wearing, engraved with his late father's initials, LT, for Lewis Till. Now, the grotesque state of Emmett's body, it shocked his family, and later it shocked the world. And his mother, Mamie Till-Mobley, so she made the historic decision to have an open casket funeral in Chicago because she insisted, let the world see what they did to my boy. And the thousands of mourners who filed past Emmett's coffin, and the millions who later saw the photographs published in Jet magazine, they witnessed the brutality of racial hatred laid bare. His swollen, mutilated face, it became an enduring image of American injustice. So the historical significance of the abduction and murder. Now, the act of dragging Emmett Till from his bed at night, it was symbolic of the long-standing reign of terror inflicted upon black communities in the South. The nighttime abductions, often at gunpoint, were the hallmark of lynch mobs seeking to instill fear. And the torture and the sadism, it reflected not just a personal act of cruelty, but a systemic form of racial violence intended to reassert dominance over black life and behavior. And the use of the cotton gin fan as a weight, it was tragically symbolic because cotton was the very crop that had enslaved African Americans for centuries, has enslaved African Americans. And now, as a tool of its production, was used as an instrument of death. So by leaving his body in the Tallahatchie River, Bryant and Milam attempted to erase him. Instead, the recovery of Emmett's body ignited a movement that cannot be drowned. So, and next part is the trial of Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam. Now, Roy Bryant, who was Carolyn's husband, and his half brother J.W. Milam were arrested and they were charged with the murder of Emmett Till after his mutilated body was discovered in the Tallahatchie River on August 31st, 1955. And local authorities, under national and international scrutiny due to widespread media coverage, they had little choice but to proceed with a trial. So, despite the overwhelming evidence and the witness testimony, the defense, the defense now, really, despite all of this, the defense rested on two things: the racial hierarchy of Mississippi courts, where the white men stood above reproach when accused of harming black people, and secondly, casting doubt on the body's identity, with defense attorneys suggesting that the bloated, disfigured corpse might not even have been Till's. So the trial was held in the Tallahatchie County Courthouse in Sumner, Mississippi, beginning on September 19th, 1955. Now, the atmosphere was heavily charged because you had an all-white male jury. Because at this time period, black citizens and women were systematically excluded from the jury service through discriminatory laws and practices, ensuring that the 12 jurors represented white male interests alone. And you also had the segregated seating because the courtroom itself, it reflected the Jim Crow system. Because white attendees, they sat in the main section while the black attendees were confined to a segregated area. And the journalists from around the country, even the international press, they were present, amplifying the trial's visibility. And also, it was a symbol of defiance because for many white Mississippians, The trial was not just about Bryant and Milam, but it was about defending the Southern way of life against the perceived Northern interference and the pressure from the burgeoning civil rights movement. And perhaps the most dramatic and historically significant moment of the trial came from Moses Wright, Emmett Till's great uncle, who had hosted Till during his visit to Mississippi. Now, when asked in court if he could identify the men who abducted Till from his home in the middle of the night, Wright, knowing full well the danger of contradicting white authority in Mississippi, he stood up. He stood up, he raised his arm, and he pointed directly at Bryant and Milam, declaring, "There he is." Now, see, this act of defiance, it was unprecedented because it was exceedingly rare in 1955 Mississippi for a black man to openly accuse white men in court of committing a crime, especially something as heinous as murder. Now, Wright's courage, it became a defining moment, symbolizing resistance to racial terror and inspiring generations in the civil rights movement. And the defense attorneys, the defense attorneys, they relied on a strategy of racial solidarity and victim blaming because they cast doubt on whether the mutilated body was truly Emmett Till, implying that it could have been planted by the NAACP to stir outrage. And they also attempted to portray Bryant and Milam as the protectors of Southern white womanhood. And the jury, so they deliberated for just 67 minutes before returning a verdict of not guilty. And one juror later told reporters that it wouldn't have taken that long if we hadn't stopped to drink pop. And 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 excuse my language. Excuse my language, ladies and gentlemen. So excuse my language here, but that is absolute complete bullshit. That is absolute bullshit right there. And like that. That remark alone is absolute bullshit. So my apologies. Excuse my language, but just disgusting. And this flippant remark, it revealed the complete disregard that the jurors had for the life of Emmett Till and the trial itself. So their decision was not based on evidence or justice, but on preserving the white impunity in the Jim Crow South. So the acquittal was met with outrage across the nation and internationally. So civil rights leaders, journalists, and everyday citizens, they pointed to it as clear evidence of the systemic failure of American justice when it came to race. But the most shocking twist, it actually came from the following year, because in January 1956, protected by the Double Jeopardy Clause, which what this basically means is it pretty much prevents someone from being tried again for the same crime after an acquittal. Bryant and Milam, they both sat down with journalist William Bradford Hugh for a paid interview in Look magazine. For $4,000, they both confessed in detail to abducting, torturing, and murdering Emmett Till. Now, in the article, they described how they pistol whipped the boy, how they shot him, and they dumped his body into the river. So far from expressing guilt or shame, they were defiant, even arrogant. And Milam, he famously stated, saying, "What else could we do?" He thought he was as good as any white man. Now, this statement encapsulated the mindset that underpinned not only the murder, but the system of white supremacy in the South. See, violence was used to enforce the racial hierarchy, punishing any black person who challenged it, real or imagined. Now, and also the trial of both Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam was a watershed moment in American history because really so really while it ended in injustice for Emmett Till, it galvanized the civil rights movement because you had national impact. Because see, the acquittal was widely reported, and the open defiance of the killers horrified the public. Emmett Till's death and his mother Mamie Till-Mobley's decision to hold an open casket funeral showing his mutilated body, it exposed the brutality of Jim Crow to the world and symbol of injustice because the trial, it became a symbol of the racial inequalities of the American legal system, demonstrating how the law was bent to maintain white supremacy. And last but not least, it was also a catalyst for action because Rosa Parks, she would later cite Emmett Till as a direct influence when she refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus in December 1955, sparking the Montgomery bus boycott. And speaking of that, I also do want to actually continue that, continuing on the impact that the impact that this had on the civil rights movement. Now, Emmett Till's murder quickly transcended the boundaries of Mississippi because once again, his mother, so her decision to hold an open casket funeral in Chicago, it allowed over 50,000 mourners to view her son's mutilated body, and was an act. So this was an act of radical protest. And you had Jet magazine, you even had the Chicago Defender and other black press outlets that published photographs of Till's corpse, which exposed the sheer inhumanity of the racial terror to millions who cannot ignore the brutality. And what this did was it's got a lot of global attention because you had newspapers in Europe and Latin America and even in Africa that reported on the lynching and even framing it as evidence of America's hypocrisy, especially during the time of the Cold War. Because the US, they claimed to champion democracy abroad, but Till's murder revealed the glaring racial injustice at home. So this undermined US credibility on the world stage, especially among emerging African and Asian nations. And the symbolism. See, Till, he came to embody every black child in America, vulnerable to white racial violence, and his death, it personalized the systemic injustice and made it impossible for activists and ordinary citizens alike to dismiss the urgency of change. And also as I said before with Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. Now the impact of Till's murder was immediate and deeply personal for African Americans across the country. So later in 1955, just a few months after Till's lynching, Rosa Parks refused to surrender her bus seat to a white passenger in Montgomery, Alabama. Now, when asked what gave her the strength to resist, she later explained that I thought about Emmett Till and I couldn't go back. Now, this statement is crucial because it demonstrates that Parks's act was not spontaneous, but it was connected to a growing collective consciousness shaped by Till's murder. Because her defiance, it sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, a pivotal event that is often recognized as the formal launch of the modern civil rights movement. And without the moral catalyst of Till's murder, Parks and others might not have acted with the same urgency and resolve. And thus, Emmett Till's death, it became the invisible force behind one of the most important acts of civil disobedience in American history. Now, Emmett Till's murder also deeply influenced a generation of leaders and activists who would define the civil rights movement. Now, you had Martin Luther King. So, Martin Luther King, and already, while he was already active in Montgomery, Till's death reinforced the stakes of nonviolent protest. So King, he often referenced racial violence as the moral foundation of his call for justice. And Till's murder, it validated his insistence that the movement, it had to be both urgent and national. And you also have John Lewis. So as a teenager in Troy, Alabama, Lewis was horrified by the news of Till's killing, and it solidified his sense of mission, leading him to join the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a committee, also known as the SNCC, and later become one of the Big Six leaders of the movement. And Lewis himself, he described Till as a wake up call for young activists who realized that they could no longer remain passive. And last, you also had Medgar Evers. And at the time of Till's murder, Evers was the NAACP's field secretary in Mississippi. He took part in the investigation, helping to collect testimony and evidence. And he also, so his activism, so Evers' activism in the aftermath of the case, and not only put him in direct confrontation with Mississippi's white power structure, but also positioned him as a future martyr himself when he was assassinated in 1963. Now, each of these figures represent how Till's death, how it planted the seeds of determination and courage within individuals who would go on to shape the course of the movement. So, although Till's killers, although they were acquitted by an all-white jury, the injustice of the trial, it did drew so really it drew a lot of national attention to the deep flaws of the Southern legal system. So the outrage highlighted the need for federal intervention in civil rights, since state level institutions consistently failed to protect African Americans. So, this, of course, is when you had the Montgomery bus boycott, also leading to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, the boycott, it set a precedent for sustained collective action that ultimately led to landmark legislative changes. Because by linking Till's death to the boycott, one can trace a direct line from his murder to the passage of civil rights legislation nearly a decade later. And then the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, this outlawed segregation in public places and it banned employment discrimination. And this can be understood as part of the long arc of justice that began with Till's murder. So his case, it forced Americans to confront the brutality of racism in ways that created political momentum to for reform. Now, the psychological impact of Emmett Till's murder, it cannot be overstated because for African Americans, especially in the South, it reinforced the reality that even a child was not safe from racial terror. At the same time, it sparked a refusal to continue living in silent fear. Now, Till was only 14 years old, which resonated strongly with the black youth because his death made it clear that young people had as much at stake in the fight for freedom as adults. And this realization, it fueled the participation of students in sit-ins, the freedom rides, and voter registration drives in the 1960s. And Till's story also became a cultural touchstone in speeches, in sermons, in music, and later in literature and film. And his image endured as a reminder of both suffering and resistance. So there were also later developments and investigations that also continued later on, decades later, moving on forward. So in 2004, nearly 50 years after Till's murder, the case was formally reopened in 2004 by the U.S. Department of Justice. And the reopening was largely motivated by new evidence unearthed through documentary work and scholarly investigation. Most notably, filmmaker Keith Beauchamp's documentary, "The Untold Story of Emmett Lewis Till," 2003. So this provided compelling interviews and it pointed to the involvement of more individuals beyond Milam and Bryant, because the film alleged that the other local men and possibly Carolyn Bryant herself had played a role in Till's abduction and his murder. And the DOJ, they announced that it would re-examine whether the federal charges, particularly under civil rights statutes, could be brought against surviving individuals given the legal constraints of double jeopardy, which once again, double jeopardy prevented Milam and Bryan from ever being retried after their acquittal. And the focus shifted to whether others could be implicated. And also as part of the renewed investigation, Emmett Till's body was exhumed in June 2005 from the Burr Oak Cemetery in Alsip, Illinois. And this was a significant step. When his body was first recovered in 1955, no autopsy had been performed, and the condition of his body had been widely publicized due to the decision by his mother, Mamie Till-Mobley, to hold an open casket funeral, allowing the world to witness the brutality inflicted upon him. The 2005 autopsy was conducted by the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office, and the findings confirmed several critical details. So, first, it was a cause of death. Emmett Till died from a gunshot wound to the head, consistent with the testimony that he was actually shot before being dumped in the Tallahatchie River, and the evidence of torture. Now, his body showed severe trauma, including fractures and injuries indicative of a violent beating. And the physical state is that the exam, it reaffirmed the scale of mutilation that had shocked the public in 1955. So this autopsy, it gave forensic confirmation to what had long been known, anecdotally and photographically. So Till's murder was not only a killing, but a torture and a lynching. So in 2007, a new revelation seemed to deepen the tragedy and injustice because historian Timothy B. Tyson, he interviewed Carolyn Bryant Donham, formerly Carolyn Bryant, the woman whose accusation set the chain of events in motion. Now, in a recorded conversation, Carolyn reportedly admitted that part of her original story, that Emmett Till had made lewd advances, grabbed her hand, and made sexually charged remarks, was fabricated. So, according to Tyson, she told him that that part's not true. So, this recantation was seismic because in 1955, her claims had provided the pretext for Ward Bryant and J.W. Milam's vigilante punishment of Till. For decades, her testimony had stood unchallenged in the official record. So if her admission was accurate, it revealed that the murder had been based on lies and racist hysteria rather than any real provocation. So, however, though, Carolyn later disputed how her words had been represented. Still, the damage of her 1955 testimony was irreversible. And by the time that this information became public, many of the principal actors in the case had died, making legal consequences unlikely. Now, the Department of Justice, once again, they reviewed the case, prompted in part by Carolyn Bryant Donham's alleged recantation. So, after examining Tyson's materials and conducting additional interviews, the DOJ concluded in December 2021, publicly reported in 2022, that there was insufficient evidence to prosecute Donham or anyone else. Now, the DOJ, they noted that while Tyson reported Carolyn's statements, he did not have a recording of the precise moment, and Carolyn herself denied recanting under later questioning without corroboration. Prosecutors concluded they could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she had lied in 1955 or that her alleged admission was legally reliable. Now, for many, this closure, it felt like another failure of the legal system, reinforcing the sense that the case remained unresolved even after nearly 7 decades. So even after nearly 7 decades. So in June 2022, an unexpected discovery reignited public outcry because you had activists and researchers that found an unserved arrest warrant from 1955 in the basement of the LaFleur County Courthouse in Mississippi. And the warrant issued for Miss Roy Bryant, known as Carolyn Bryant, accused her of involvement in Till's kidnapping. Now, at the time in 1955, Carolyn had not been arrested or brought to trial. The discovery of the document, it raised a lot of urgent questions. Why had the warrant not been served? Was it suppressed deliberately to protect the white woman in the Jim Crow South? Now, you had civil rights activists and even Till's family members and community leaders. They had seized on this discovery, demanding that Carolyn finally face accountability. And the protests, they were held across Mississippi and beyond, with chants of "serve the warrant" echoing through the court buildings and the streets. Now, despite the pressure, the Mississippi courts and the prosecutors, they declined to pursue the charges, and they argued that the statute of limitations and the evidentiary issues and Carolyn's advanced age, it made prosecution unfeasible. Now, the final chapter closed in April 2023 when Carolyn Bryant Donham died at age 88 in Westlake, Louisiana, from cancer. She died without ever being arrested, indicted, or tried for her role in Emmett Till's death. Her passing sparked renewed reflection on the meaning of justice. For many, her death without accountability symbolized the broader failures of the U.S. justice system to address the crimes of racial terror committed during the Jim Crow era. For others, it underscored the importance of historical memory. Even if she escaped formal legal punishment, history would not absolve her of it. So the later investigations into Till's murder highlight several broader themes, which, for one, you have the persistence of activism. Because, see, it was this relentless work of the filmmakers, the historians, the journalists, and Till's family that brought the renewed attention to the case. So, without their advocacy, the DOJ would never likely really have ever reopened the case. And you also have the limits of the legal remedies, because despite the new evidence and the revelations, legal accountability was never achieved. The failures were due in part to the age of the case and the death of key actors and the structural barriers like double jeopardy. And you also have the symbolism of justice that was deferred. Now the exhumation, the autopsy, and the unserved warrant symbolized how systemic racism had suppressed justice in the 1950s, and how each of those failures echoed decades later. And last but not least, the cultural resonance, because each reopening of this case, it coincided with the broader national conversations on race from the early 2000s post civil rights documentary movement to the 2020s amid the Black Lives Matter protests. So Emmett Till remained not just a victim of history, but a touchstone for the continuing struggle against racial violence. So we finally want to kind of go on ahead and really talk about the legacy of Emmett Till. So legacy of Emmett Till has become, so really it's become one of the most profound memorialization efforts in American history. The murder of the 14-year-old boy in 1955 galvanized the civil rights movement, but for decades, his memory was left in obscurity, often silenced by the same systems of fear and racial violence that had taken his life. And only in recent decades has there been a sustained movement to ensure that Till's story is preserved and is taught for future generations. So when it comes about Emmett Till's legacies, we have the Emmett Till Interpretive Center and Commission. Now, this is located in Sumner, Mississippi. The Emmett Till Interpretive Center, it was established in 2015, and its creation was spearheaded by the Emmett Till Memorial Commission of Tallahatchie County, formed in 2005 on the 50th anniversary of Till's murder. Now, the commission was a unique collaboration of both black and white community members working together to formally acknowledge the role the county had played in this tragedy and to promote racial healing. So you had the restorative justice mission. Now, the interpretive center, so when it came down to its mission, it not only preserves history, but also functions as a site of reconciliation. It hosts dialogues, community events, and educational programming that is centered on racial justice and civil rights as well. And the restoration of the courthouse, because the center, it also played a key role in restoring the Tallahatchie County Courthouse in Sumner, where Till's killers, Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam, were acquitted by an all-white jury in a trial that became a defining symbol of Jim Crow injustice. So today, the courthouse has been repurposed as a museum and a memorial site. And we also have the site where, so we have the Tallahatchie River site. So this site where Emmett Till's mutilated body was found, this site right here has become one of the most visited memorials. A historical marker was placed there in 2008, but its presence immediately it became a flashpoint of racial tension because you had the vandalism and you had resilience. Now, the original sign was riddled with bullet holes multiple times by white supremacists, reflecting the ongoing hostility to the acknowledgement of racial violence. And each time that it was defaced, the commission replaced it, and by 2019, there was a new bulletproof marker that was installed, weighing 500 pounds and made of steel, symbolizing both the physical and the metaphorical strength of the movement to preserve Till's memory. And we also have Bryant's Grocery and other key sites. Now, Bryant's Grocery and Meat Market in Money, Mississippi, where Till allegedly whistled at Carolyn Bryant, it remains one of the most haunting physical reminders of his story, because though the building it now lies in ruins, preservationists have worked to protect it as a historical landmark. And other key memorialized sites include the church, where Till's funeral was actually held in Chicago. And the church was known as the Roberts Temple Church of God in Christ. And the cemetery where he laid to rest, the Burr Oak Cemetery. And Mamie Till-Mobley's decision, once again, to hold an open casket funeral, it still remains one of the most consequential acts of resistance in American history. Her insistence that the world must see what they did to my boy, it directly fed into the iconography of the civil rights movement. So after over a century of failed attempts, there were more than 200 anti-lynching bills introduced in Congress since 1900, and lynching was finally designated as a federal hate crime in March 2022 when President Joe Biden he signed the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act into law. And this act, it carries immense symbolic weight because it legally binds Till's name to America's acknowledgement of lynching as not just individual crimes, but as acts of racial terror against terror designed to enforce white supremacy. And also by invoking Till's name, the law also ensures that his murder is not remembered solely as a tragic moment, but as a legal and historical turning point in the pursuit of racial justice. So Emmett Till's story has continued to be retold and reinterpreted through films, documentaries, literature, and visual art, each medium shaping the public's understanding of the case and its aftermath. Now, the documentaries we have are known to be on one, we have the untold story of Emmett Lewis Till, 2005. And this was directed by Keith Beauchamp. And this groundbreaking documentary, it drew on extensive research and interviews with eyewitnesses, including Carolyn Bryant herself. And his work, it directly influenced the reopening of the FBI's investigation into Till's murder in 2004, showing how the media, how they can actively shape justice decades later. And then you also have Who Killed Emmett Till, PBS Frontline in 2003. So this documentary it focused on the judicial investigative failures of the case, shedding light on new witnesses and the deep structural racism that allowed Bryant and Milam to openly admit to the murder and in a paid Look magazine interview without consequence. And we also have films. So till 2022. So this was directed uh by Shinonye Shugwu. And the film it dramatizes Mamie Till-Mobley's fight for justice, centering the narrative on her courage rather than solely on her son's suffering. And this cinematic choice, it reframed the story from the perspective of Black women's resilience and activism. And Deadweiler's performance as Mammy, it drew critical acclaim, with the film seen not just as a historical drama, but as an urgent political statement in the contemporary moment of Black Lives Matter. And we also have books. So we have The Death of Innocence that came in 2003. So by Mamie Till-Mobley and Christopher Benson. So Mamie's memoir is both a personal narrative and a public reckoning, recounting not just the loss of her son, but her transformation into an activist. So her writing reflects her lifelong mission to ensure that Emmett's death was not in vain. And second, you also have The Blood of Emmett Till that came out in 2017, and this was by Timothy B. Tyson. And this book, it revisits the case with new evidence, most notably his claims that Carolyn Bryant admitted in 2008 in a 2008 interview that she had lied about Till's alleged actions, while later reporting has cast doubt on the exact phrasing of her admission. The book reignited national debates and it brought a lot of renewed attention to the case. And we also have the art and the cultural representation. So Emmett Till has also been memorialized through music, visual art, and performance. So the music we have with Bob Dylan's "The Death of Emmett Till" that came out in 1962. So this was one of the earliest protest songs to explicitly name him, linking the case to the broader struggles of the 1960s with rap and hip hop artists from Kanye West to Lil Wayne have invoked his name, often controversially demonstrating how Till remains a symbol across generations. In the visual arts, we have Dana Schultz' 2017 painting known as Open Casket, which was displayed at the Whitney Biennial, which also sparked. So this painting it sparked fierce controversy, and the painting, as you see my mouse once again, that's moving right here. So this painting right there. So this painting it sparked a lot of fierce controversy because critics had argued that as a white artist, that Schutz's appropriation of Till's image, it was exploitative, reigniting debates about race, representation, and ownership of historical trauma. And we also have performance because you have plays such as the Ballad of Emmett Till by Ife have brought his story to the stage, making his memory a living, breathing narrative passed down through performance traditions. And with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes this video here today. Uh, but yes, but the lynching of Emmett Till. So this was not an isolated event, but a turning point in American history. His death exposed the brutality of Southern racism and the failure of the legal system to protect Black lives. His mother's courage in confronting the world with her son's mutilated body became a catalyst for the modern civil rights movement. His name is etched into legislation, memorial plaques, museums, literature, film, and art. And each retelling, whether in a book, whether in a documentary, or a courthouse exhibit, it forces new generations to confront the brutality of racial violence and the resilience of those who fight for justice. And what makes Till's legacy uniquely powerful is its intergenerational reach. Because Mamie Till-Mobley's decision to expose the truth in 1955 reverberates through the Emmett Till Interpretive Center, the Bulletproof River Marker, and the Anti-Lynching Act of 2022, and the cultural productions that refuse to let his story fade. So Emmett Till is more than just a victim. Emmett Till represents the countless Black lives lost to racial hatred, and his story continues to shape conversations around justice, memory, and resistance. So his death is not just history, it is a living reminder of America's unfinished struggle with race, justice, and memory.